House in Covington with the latest on this major development. Erica, guilty as charged?
Katie, guilty on all counts as charged. Jurors deliberated for 5 hours in the jury deliberation room. They have heard 2 weeks worth of testimony from 27 witnesses, including 5 male accusers who claim Jack Strain raped and molested them as teens and boys. And today they found him guilty of all of those charges. Now, Jack Strain and his family, they were all present in the courtroom. As soon as that first aggravated rape count came down as guilty, you could see all of their heads just go down. We know that one aggravated rape count brings with it a mandatory life sentence. So as soon as they heard that first guilty verdict, it was an instant sigh. Now, the families of 3 of the accusers were also in the courtroom. 3 of the victims, I should say. They were also in the courtroom, and as soon as we heard that those verdicts come down, you could also see a sigh of relief from their side. Katie, we'll toss it back to you. We are still waiting for the families and Strain to exit the courtroom, and we are also expecting a update from the district attorney here behind me. You can see they are getting ready for a press conference on this major news.
Erica, we're hearing some cheers of joy is what it sounds like behind you. Any idea who that's coming from and what that's about? Obviously, it seems to be something related to Strain's conviction.
Yes, Katie, it is. It looks like these are some people who are potentially part of some different sexual abuse advocate groups who have been kind of following this trial in this case for many years. They just exited the courtroom. We haven't seen any of the family leave the courtroom yet, but we know that some of them were in there. They came back after hearing those closing arguments this morning and came back to find that the verdict was guilty.
Erica, this aggravated rape conviction, he's been found guilty 4 counts of aggravated rape. Just one of those carries a mandatory life sentence in prison. So you have a sheriff who was a sheriff of 20 years now facing a mandatory life sentence in prison. You would think that that is not something that the jury took lightly when they were considering what they heard from these victims in the courtroom. And only you can tell us, Erica, because you were sitting in that trial gavel to gavel. This was detailed, very emotional testimony.
Katie, these were very detailed, very graphic, and very emotional testimonies. One of the victims was in that courtroom with his wife and his sons. They were all sitting on the front row together, and he is the victim of 3 of those aggravated rape counts. And now this is a family friend who grew up around the Strains and claimed that he began raping him when he was about 10 years old or so. Jack Strain would have been about 6 years older. And then that 4th aggravated rape count was for Mark Finn, who we have interviewed. We spoke with his mother earlier today. She was also in that courtroom in tears, as she has been throughout much of this trial.
Yeah, Erica, you know, when I interviewed Mark Finn a few years ago, when he first shared his story and was really has been the only one to break his silence so far in this situation, it was difficult to hear him talk about what he says happened to him with Strain. I mean, you don't see a man who's a self-described career criminal in tears and not be moved by that. Do you think that that's what happened with the jury here?
I think he clearly did not want to share this story. It was very obvious that he was having a hard time getting out any of the words and going through those graphic details. And they wanted to push him to share all those graphic details, and he did. And it was very obvious that it was not that easy for him when he was on the stand. And that's one of the things that the defense attorneys tried to push at, is that he clearly didn't want to make these claims and had previously said that certain sex acts didn't happen, but then on the stand changed that story. And he admitted that he didn't want to ever have to say this, and kind of over time gradually started opening up more about what actually happened with him and Jack Strain. And I think they heard these emotional testimonies that seemed like you really couldn't make these up. And I think it was enough to prove that Jack Strain was guilty.
Now, in this case, we also heard from the relatives of some of those victims. I mean, that's one of the things that I think struck me when I would talk to you about what happened in court, is that not only did they call the victims in the case, but they called the victims' relatives and talked about the timeline in which they started to come forward and talk about what they say happened to them over the years with Strain. That seemed to be backing up the stories of many of these victims and friends, family members even of Strain's, who now he's convicted of aggravated rape, aggravated incest, among other charges with. And so I think that those extra witnesses that backed up their testimony and backed up their timelines was probably convincing.
Right, Katie. And just with the first victim, who is the victim of the first 3 aggravated rape counts, his wife, 2 of his sons, they all testified that he shared with him that he was raped with them back in 2013. And of course, that's before he told the FBI and IRS in 2017. So they corroborated that story, saying that, yes, he shared with us that he was molested and raped as a boy and as a teenager by Jack Strain back in 2013. And these are, his 2 adult sons making these claims, and admitted that, it was difficult for them to hear from their adult father that this is, the reason he believed that he had so much anger throughout his life, and admitted to them that he wasn't always a good father, and said that I have an explanation.
Real quick here on Channel 4, talk about what Strain's defense attorneys had to say, because they really took a leap here by not putting on a defense other than through closing arguments. Strain, of course, did not take the stand to testify in his own defense. Talk about what their closing arguments were to the jury that clearly the jury found ineffective, because they've rendered this guilty as charged verdict today.
Well, the defense claimed that this was all a conspiracy by the FBI and the IRS, that they, were trying to create this, these allegations to take down Jack Strain. Of course, it all started after 2017, when they started looking into the work release program. And that's when the first victim told them his story and said that there was more to Jack Strain than what they were there to investigate. And so I think they said that they were just trying to take him down. But then their other defense was that some of the stories have changed, that, Mark Finn, for one, has previously said some things and on the stand said another, which he did explain and explain to the jurors why his story has changed. But I think that was their big defense, was that, can you really find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt if his story has changed throughout the years? But they did.
Erica Ferrando, thank you for your reporting on this. We're going to let you go here on Channel 4, but stick with us, because we're going to talk to her over on WWLTV.com and, of course, our Facebook page for a little bit longer as we wait to hear from prosecutors in this case. A huge win for the St. Tammany Parish District Attorney's Office tonight. Jack Strain, former St. Tammany Sheriff, found guilty as charged on all 8 sex crimes counts. Now, of course, he's still facing another trial in December on a public corruption case that's going to be in federal court. But for now, guilty as charged. And of course, we'll have the very latest for you coming up on the Eyewitness News at 10. But for now, let's go back to your regularly scheduled programming.
This has been breaking news from Channel 4's Eyewitness News. For the latest updates, go to WWLTV.com, the Channel 4 app, or our social media pages.
We are continuing our coverage of the verdict in the Jack Strain sex crimes trial. Former St. Tammany Sheriff Jack Strain found guilty on all 8 sex crimes charges. Erica Ferrando has been in the courtroom throughout for the trial, and I want to bring her back in with us to talk a little bit more about what she's been hearing throughout the 2-week-long trial. Erica, are you with us?
Hey, Katie. Yes, I'm here. And yes, it has been a very long, emotional 2 weeks of testimony.
Today, some of the detail that you were getting from these witnesses, and I don't think that it's something that we can really get into fully because we're so limited in terms of time and what we put on TV. But, we talked about a situation with one of the victims that You know, just the emotional control that it sounds like these people felt like Strain had over their lives. Many of them worked for him at the sheriff's office. Many of them were tied to that work release program, which I assume we're going to hear more about in federal court as those charges are taken to trial in December. But talk about the emotional control that it seems like these people really felt like Strain had over them.
Well, Katie, just starting with the first victim, who is the victim of 3 of the aggravated rape counts. I mean, this is someone who grew up around Strain and said that he saw him as sort of a father figure / older brother, someone who, you know, would take him four-wheeling and would do a lot of fun things. And we were, you know, kind of explained what this grooming process is by some of the expert witnesses that we heard from, and how they are able, or how these predators and accusers, or these predators are able to kind of groom a victim into, you know, kind of listening to them, and they start by giving them gifts and doing all these fun activities, and then it starts with just some small touching, and then it ends up, you know, over time being rape. And so that first victim, he also ended up working under Strain when he was sheriff, and not only him, but then his wife and one of his sons ended up working under him. And so it seemed like Jack Strain always had this control over him, and that's kind of what he testified as well. But one other interesting thing about this victim is that he said, you know, I still love him. I still love Jack Strain, and I can't explain it. I don't know why. I always wanted his approval. But I think that was kind of explained to us by an expert witness as well, that that's not a surprising thing to hear from these victims. And then, you know, you spoke with Mark Finn, and he's another one of the victims who said that he, you know, always had that same kind of connection with Jack Strain growing up, that he was older, kind of like an older brother, and did all these fun things with him. And then he ended up being incarcerated, and, you know, testified that he had a lot of special treatment while he was incarcerated in St. Tammany Parish. And so that was still some control that it appears Jack Strain had over him, even when they were adults.
Yeah, it sounds like that situation was something that we heard consistently through a number of these victims who we are now calling victims because this conviction. Sharice Gibson's joining me now as we continue our coverage of the Jack Strain verdict. Guilty as charged on all 8 sex crimes. And Erica, you know, this situation has been one that I think a lot of people were shocked and stunned and quite frankly didn't believe when they first heard it, because we're talking about the top law enforcement officer in that parish, who was the top law enforcement officer for 20 years. So in order to overcome that hurdle in people's minds, you know, these victims must have been pretty convincing on the witness stand.
And the fact that some people didn't believe it was the reason that the fifth victim came forward. Now, there were no charges for this 5th victim, and that's because he came forward after Jack Strain was already indicted in 2017. He saw your story with Mark Finn on the news, and apparently this is another family member, and a lot of his family members who were also Jack Strain's family members were saying there's no way this is true. I don't believe this criminal. This is all a lie. And that's when he testified. He decided to go up to the district attorney's office himself and say that, no, this is very possible because this is what happened to me. And that 5th victim testified that when he was a young boy, Jack Strain raped him in a tent. And if I'm remembering correctly, I believe Jack Strain was 4 years older than him. So they were young at the time. And he said it happened multiple times. And the difference between this victim and the others is that he had no connection to the other victims. All the other victims are pretty tied together and they know each other. This 5th victim was kind of a surprise to the other victims. They would ask if he knew who this was, and they all said no. And so, it was kind of like his reason for wanting to come forward in the first place is that no one was believing Mark Finn when his story aired on our station.
It'll be interesting to see if there are more victims who end up coming forward, if there are more victims out there now that we do see this conviction. And I was talking to an attorney, a couple of them actually, and I think what I heard from them consistently as they were looking at this case and saying, I wonder what's going to happen, many of them said, you know, you have one accuser, you can dispute that as a defense attorney. You have two, you can overcome that as a defense attorney. It becomes incredibly difficult to overcome it whenever you have 3, 4, and in this case 5 victims who've come forward.
And as you heard from a lot of the people and a lot of their testimony, which was in following this case, Erica, and congratulations, of course, on an amazing job you've done on this sort of storytelling, but just listening to some of their testimony has been incredibly hard for a lot of people to hear, especially listening to that man's mother. I believe that was Mark's mother that we heard earlier today talk about the fact that she wasn't there, that she didn't know. And it looks like we're about to have a news conference right now, just a couple of minutes, literally, after Strain gets that guilty count on all counts.
St. Tammany DA Warren Montgomery is walking to the podium with his prosecutors who have been working diligently, literally for years on this investigation and on this case. Colin Sims, who is one of his heads of criminal over there. So let's hear from Warren Montgomery.
Good evening. My name is Warren Montgomery, District Attorney. On my left is Colin Sims, Assistant District Attorney, Chief of the Criminal Division. And on my right is the other prosecutor, Elizabeth Hoffman. Both of these individuals prosecuted the Jack Strain case. The jury just returned their verdict. He was found guilty on all 8 counts, and he's been remanded to the custody of the state of Louisiana. Sentencing is set for January 18th. I want to take this opportunity to thank the judge, Judge Simpson, and especially the jurors who spent over 2 weeks listening to evidence and deliberating in this matter. Our society cannot function without their courage and their diligence and dedication. So we thank them for their service to our community, to our state. I also want to thank the investigation team. This was the work of many, many people, and I'm only going to mention a few, from the FBI, Special Agent Wayne Horner, from the IRS, Special Agent Tim Moore, from Louisiana State Police, Trooper Malcolm Brown, from United States Postal Service, Special Agent Allison Hoffine and Special Agent Steve Smolchik. All of these individuals worked very, very hard to bring justice to the victims in this case, and there were many other individuals behind them, supporting them and their agencies. So this was a collaborative effort, and I'm thankful on behalf of the state, the people of the state of Louisiana, the people of St. Tammany Parish. I thank them for their efforts and their hard work. Finally, I mentioned Colin Sims and Elizabeth Hoffman. They did an excellent job, and I commend them for their work, for their courage, their diligence, and their dedication. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the head of our investigative unit, Vince Saltaformaggio, who did yeoman's work, and as well with the executive assistant to Colin Sims, Melanie Bro. All of those people worked very hard and were very courageous in their duties, and I'm thankful for the work that they did and for the results that they've achieved. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Where is Jack Strain headed to currently?
He, like any person who's been found guilty of a crime and who's remanded to the custody, he will be brought presumably to the St. Tammany Parish Jail, just as he was held before, after his arrest. He'll be held at the St. Tammany Parish Jail. At some point in time, after sentencing, he will be turned over to the Department of Corrections for the state of Louisiana.
With his law enforcement background, how will his life behind bars, how will that differ because of his background?
Well, certainly he'll be in a secure environment. It's the obligation of the state of Louisiana to make sure that all inmates are protected and kept safe. and have proper medical care. And so that obligation exists for Jack Strain as well as anyone else.
Is it safe to say Jack Strain will die in jail following this?
I'm not going to mention that. He's facing life in prison. So it's without benefit of probation or parole.
What was the hardest part of this case for y'all? This has been a long journey.
Well, I guess each of my assistant district attorneys could comment on that. I think the most important part of the case was the preparation, and a lot of preparation went into this case, a lot of hard work, and Jack Strain was a very powerful and influential individual. This was a high-stakes prosecution, and I'd like to commend these two prosecutors for their courage in taking on this case. And maybe that's the most distinguishing characteristic of this prosecution.
Well, what do you think it says about the American justice system that a man who at one time was the highest law enforcement person in this parish for so long can be brought to justice as we've seen here today?
Well, obviously, it shows that no one is above the law, but it also shows that our system, although not perfect, works. And there have been a lot of attacks, so to speak, on the criminal justice system and on those in law enforcement. And this prosecution shows that the system can police itself, that the system works, and that our citizens should have confidence in the American system of justice.
This is some justice for these 5 victims we heard from. Can you talk about what you hope they take from this verdict?
One of the interesting aspects to this case is that, as painful as this process has been for the victims, for some of the victims at least, it's been very therapeutic, because they finally had their time in which they could speak about what they suffered, what happened to them, and that in some sense justice has been achieved on their behalf. And so, as painful again as this entire process has been for the criminal justice system, for the jurors listening to the testimony, for our entire system, there's been a benefit in that those victims now know that that justice has been served, and I hope that that helps them reach some closure in their lives.
What do you think of Billy Gibbons' claim that this was a government conspiracy?
It was a false claim. This was not I didn't conspire with my assistants, and they didn't conspire with the grand jury, and the grand jury didn't conspire with the IRS and all those other agencies and the Trilateral Commission or anybody else. So that's it. That's an argument that he made, and I'm not going to criticize that argument, but obviously the jury didn't believe it. The grand jury didn't feel that way. And I think those of you who were in the courtroom and heard the witnesses testify, it's clear that you would have to be a master choreographer, a master director, and you'd have to be the best actors in the history of the world to believe that this was some conspiracy. Those witnesses spoke the truth, and it was evidenced in what they said and how they reacted, and I'm happy for them.
Was he brought down by greed or lust?
I'm not going to speculate on that. I think there was some argument by both of my assistants about that, and that's really a question for other people besides ourselves.
Do you think it's likely there are more victims who never came forward?
Yes.
What makes you say that?
Well, there were some other victims that contacted us, and but we didn't feel that we needed them at this particular point in time. We felt we could achieve justice, and frankly, it's very painful for victims to testify in a public forum. And to the extent that we can save victims from going through that pain, and still achieve the ends of justice, we felt that was the right thing to do.
What would be your message to Jack Strain this evening?
I really don't have a message to Jack Strain. He faced his accusers. I think they had a message for him.
Or in this day and age, these types of cases, people expect to see DNA evidence, physical evidence. How difficult was that bar for you all to sort of hurdle and decided to go forward with this? What was the determining factor to go forward with this case since there was so little physical evidence?
Well, first off, let me say there was a lot of direct evidence. We had 5 individuals take the stand and testify, and it was clear by their testimony that they were telling the truth. However, it is correct that these incidences, some of them, happened many, many years ago, and that was a challenge for us as a prosecution team. But as a result of the hard work of these different law enforcement personnel, we felt that if we could corroborate their stories, and if some additional victims would arrive on the scene, then we would have a compelling case. And I think it was a convincing case. The jury certainly felt that way and returned a verdict, on the same day that that they were given their jury instructions. So these cases can be proven. And again, I want to commend the people in law enforcement and also these 2 assistants who worked very, very hard to corroborate the testimony of the witnesses.
Were some of the victims that came forward, were they minors?
Pardon?
The other victims that came forward, were they minors?
Yes. At the time of the allegation that they made, yes. Any other
Can
questions?
you talk about the quick guilty verdict that the jury came to?
I wasn't surprised because, again, the evidence was compelling. The evidence was overwhelming. The evidence was convincing. And I think the jury, frankly, took their time and analyzed the evidence that they had and discussed among themselves and came to the right conclusion. But those of you who watched the trial, you saw individuals who clearly were not fabricating evidence. They were not manipulated, and they were not manipulating the system. And the jury saw that, and with that overwhelming amount of evidence, they reached the conclusion, and there was no reason to spend another night or another minute considering the guilt or innocence. All right. Thank you very much.
Good job, Walt.
All right.
All right, St. Tammany Parish District Attorney Warren Montgomery there having a news conference about this guilty verdict in the Jack Strain case. Strain, of course, found guilty on all 8 sex crimes charges tonight by a jury, which means that 12 people had to find him guilty unanimously on every single count. And it's just stunning.
Yeah, the stunning, and before, of course, we heard from Mr. Montgomery. I was listening to Erica Ferrando and just talking about the days leading up to this moment, the testimony. It was just gut-wrenching, what they had to listen to, and just to your point earlier, talking about the fact that you have one person that comes forward, but when another comes forward, and then family members come forward, and this was something Warren Montgomery mentioned, this is therapeutic for these people to get something that they've been holding on to in their systems and in their memories for so long out. And finally, to see some justice in this case.
Yeah, and Erica,
which started with your investigation.
It did, yeah. We started looking into the work release programs. Sarah Pagonis and I and Gordon Russell and some others over at the Times-Picayune New Orleans Advocate, and we started looking into the sweetheart deals that some of these people were given to run these work release programs. And then we also started chronicling the allegations of lax supervision, that they weren't being run properly. And so we were doing a number of stories about that. And that's when federal investigators stepped in and started looking into some of those allegations, specifically the contract with the Slidell work release program, and how that had gone to 2 of Strain's top deputies, who have since pleaded guilty in federal court to bribing Jack Strain in a kickback scheme. Strain, of course, has not been convicted of that at this point. That's another trial that he's supposed to stand in federal court in December. But it all stemmed from that. And I think one of the things that is of note, Erica is out with Warren Montgomery tonight, and she asked him in that press conference, do you think there are more victims out there who have not come forward? And not only did he say yes immediately, he said, I know that there are more victims. We interviewed more victims. They just weren't a part of this trial. We felt like we didn't need them, and so we ended up not putting them through, you know, the difficult time that a trial is for so many of these people. I mean, this is just something that tears your life apart.
It's a traumatic experience that you go through, and so many of the victims that we've heard from, the testimonies that we've heard, were people saying that they were ashamed to step forward. They didn't know what to say. One of the victims, you interviewed, I believe, interviewed several years ago, and said, you know, this is what led to my substance abuse, what led to multiple arrests, you know, spending a lot of time in jail, a lot of them trying to numb some of that pain. So if you can imagine the hardship that some of these victims had to go through, and the courage that it took to step forward to talk about what is probably one of the most painful points of their lives, we know that there are probably so many other victims that are out there who have yet to say anything just yet. And also we just confirmed there from Warren Montgomery that there are so many victims out there that are still standing by and probably, you know, sitting at home knowing that justice has been served.
Yeah, and this, I mean, you know, a jury has found him guilty of all of these charges. And just when you think about the secret that has been following Jack Strain around for his 20-year career as the top law enforcement officer in St. Tammany Parish, if this conviction holds and this holds true, that is quite a secret to carry around with you as you're, you know, continuing to run for office. He was the Abita Springs police chief before he became sheriff in St. Tammany. And as we've heard from these victims throughout the trial, they've said that some of these charges stem from things that happened when he was sheriff. Yeah,
when he was sheriff. So they said, I think you believe that, and correct me if I'm wrong, it started some of these in the late 70s, going into the 2000s. So this is a long line there could be so many other victims and so many other things that we haven't even touched when it comes to this trial. But he has been found guilty on all counts, and we just heard that, of course, he's being held at the St. Tammany Parish Jail. And then from there will be delivered to the state.
Yep, to the Department of Corrections. Apparently his defense attorneys, Billy Gibbons, was polling the jury, asking the jurors to identify how they each voted, and obviously they all voted guilty because the verdicts now have to be unanimous in the state of Louisiana. So now Jack Strain is being booked into the St. Tammany Jail, the facility that he once ran. And this is the second time, because when he was initially arrested by investigators, he was taken there as well and booked the first time. He's been out on bond awaiting trial for this case and, of course, the federal case. But we're going to have a whole lot more coming up on the Eyewitness News at 10.
And, of course, Erica has been out there following along with this. We have Paul Dudley later on joining us to continue this story. And, of course, Katie Moore has been following along with this investigation since the very beginning. So, of course, all of this information, everything, if you missed anything, we have it on our